hopefully it'll be quick. We'll see. I haven't actually given this version of the talk before. So, and then after that, we'll take, I think, a little break and try and do some hands-on. I'll walk you guys through the tutorial that we've created for it, so that if you have questions or things don't work or you're curious about something, it'll be an opportunity to do that with your hands on the keyboard. So first of all, who are we? So I am a senior engineer at Johnson & Johnson. I'm broadly responsible for architecture of the consumer digital platform at J&J. There's 3 sectors at Johnson & Johnson: consumer, pharma, and medical devices. Consumer has the biggest digital footprint, although the smallest revenue for the company, which is interesting. And we basically, consumer is what you think about when you're thinking about Johnson & Johnson. Mostly it's our brands like baby powder and Listerine and Band-Aid and stuff like that. And the project is sponsored by a group within J&J, which is relatively new in its first year, called the Open Source Working Group. There has been a renewed commitment in JJ Technology to give back to the open source community. This is probably the largest project that we've open sourced, but there have been some others, and you can see what we've done at GitHub on Johnson & Johnson. I also want to shout out to the partners who we have worked with on this project, and I will introduce them and then ask the people who are on the line from those partners to introduce themselves. But before I do that, let me ask the people from J&J to introduce themselves. Daniel, I think you're on the line, right?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Munter. I also work for J&J Consumer. I am the product owner for our web systems and for Bodiless. So I'm Chris's product counterpart.
And Duan and Ali, I think you're on.
Yeah. Hey guys. Yeah, it's Ali here. I've been working with Chris on this project, Johnson & Johnson, for about 6 months so far. I'll try my best to help out if I can.
Hi guys. This is Duan. I'm a Drupal developer. Before I was working on the Drupal 7 and 8 and moved to this JAMstack last year. So yeah.
And I think that's it from J&J, yeah? Cool. All right. So the key partners working with us on this project, first of all, Phase 2 Technology has provided a lot of architectural guidance and product support for this. Eric, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry. I'm Eric Summerfield. I'm a director in engineering at Phase 2. And yeah, I've been locked up with Chris, enjoying this trip for the last 2 years on Bodiless, and then another 2 years before that with the rest of the J&J team on the old platform.
Is there anyone else from Phase 2? Sophia's on the line or no? Probably not.
I don't think so. I think that Sophia is got her hands full.
Yeah, I'm sure. So Phase 2, also EPAM Systems has done a lot of architectural work and also a lot of hands-on development. We have a few people from EPAM on the line. If you want to introduce yourselves.
Yep. Hi, everyone. So my name is Ivan. I'm mostly a front-end engineer, front-end, back-end, everything. So I work as part of an EPAM team. Yeah, we're just doing great things here all together. That's worth sharing.
Anyone else? Tanya, are you on the line? You want to say hi?
Yes, hello. My name is Tatiana. I am a lead software testing engineer from EPAM side. I'm working for that project since last July. So, hello, everyone.
Anyone else from EPAM? Cool, thanks. And last but not least, I want to shout out to Godfrey Systems. And Heidi, I think you're on the line.
She actually had to drop, Chris.
Oh, she did have to drop? Okay, well.
I came up with her squatting situation.
It did, okay. So I just want to definitely shout out Heidi Vanya, who's been a key both architecture and product resource on this platform. And there are many others who are not here who have also assisted. It's been a fairly large team. So let me first, before I talk about what Bodiless is, talk about the problem space that we're trying to address. Johnson & Johnson is a very large company, as you probably may have heard. And the consumer division of Johnson & Johnson owns a lot of brands. And they range from OTC brands like Tylenol and Motrin through beauty brands like Neutrogena, baby products, Johnson Baby, Band-Aid, Listerine, Clean and Clear. So many, many, many brands that have a presence all around the world. So hundreds of markets all over the 4 regions. We call them, we claim that there are 4 regions. Which leads to a consumer portfolio of over 800 websites. And the real issue is that we want to be able to reuse. We want, as a large corporation with a global presence, we want to be able to build tools that ease the path for our brands to create their local websites. But at the same time, we want to allow the brands to differentiate. Listerine does not want to look like Clean and Clear in any way, shape, or form. And we also want to enable specific regional requirements. So in different places, there are different third-party services they may want to use. In EMEA, there's GDPR. There's a lot of requirements. In Canada, there are very stringent accessibility requirements. So we want to be able to reuse things, but then also allow people to customize them and change them. So there are also some specific challenges that we're facing right now as we think about what to do. One of them is that in our marketing, most changes or many changes to websites involve changes both to the content and to the code. They usually, if they make a copy change on a website, they want to change the styling a little bit. Or if they have a campaign, the campaign doesn't just involve new content, it also involves new graphics, new code, new layouts, new look and feel for the website. And as I'll get to later, that has posed some unique challenges for us. We also have a situation where Johnson & Johnson tends to oscillate back and forth between very strong central governance, or at least an aspiration towards very strong central governance, and then decentralization, where regions actually take a lot of control. We're on a swing now where we're moving towards that decentralized model, which makes it very difficult for a global team to legislate the way things should be done. We also have, this is not exactly a challenge, but it's definitely a parameter. There is, at this point in consumer, very little content reuse across channels. There's actually very little content reuse even across websites. Excuse me. I don't have a fever, so I think I'm okay. But this may change. So there is always talk and aspirations to move to a more content-first marketing strategy. So even though the current state situation doesn't involve much content reuse, we need to design for a situation where there may be increasingly that use case. And then generally speaking, diminishing global IT budgets. J&J wants to spend less on their websites. So we're trying to address that as well. So where are we now? The current state solution, we call it Canvas. It is a Drupal 7 based platform. It's very large Drupal 7 based platform. I think there are hundreds of contrib modules. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Drupal.
There are over 500.
What's that?
There are over 500.
Over 500, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot. And there's also a lot of custom code, thousands of lines of custom code. It was designed to be a single platform that everybody would share the same code base, in contradistinction to a distribution that would kind of be developed and handed off and people could do with what they wanted. The idea behind Canvas is that it would be a single thing that everyone would use and build their websites on. A SaaS, a software as a service, essentially an internally developed software as a service offering. It would then be extended and customized at the brand level to provide kind of a unique look and feel for that particular brand. And then at the market level, to provide all the individual local market websites that were associated with a particular brand. And for some brands that could be 20 or 30, and for some brands it might be 1. It really depends on how global the brand is. So the idea behind Canvas was I should probably have prefaced this with the fact that before Canvas, it was kind of the Wild West. We actually had a Wild West slide with horses on it, which I decided not to include. It was that distribution idea. There was a Drupal distribution that had been developed internally that was then handed off to people to do with what they wanted. So we had essentially every region, every brand, every market developing from scratch their website. And obviously some brands have more money and some brands have less. So the quality of the websites varied greatly. The advice that they got on what was good and what was bad varied. So the idea was to say, hey, we are going to provide you out of the box with a platform that gives you the best in class in terms of UX, IA, performance, SEO, accessibility, all the things that you don't really want to worry about if you're a marketer bringing your site to market. You just want to have those things. So the idea was to provide those things. The idea was to provide reusability of capabilities. So lots of times we have a capability, for example, a ratings and reviews capability that is useful in many, many, many markets. We didn't want to have to redevelop that every time. We wanted to be able to say, here's your ratings and reviews capability, take it and run with it. And true of many other capabilities that were built into the platform. And then another idea was operational efficiency. So finding a way to make it easy for people to create a website quickly. I think the aspiration was always push button. I click a button, I get a website. But a shared set of DevOps tooling, a shared set of processes that allowed you very quickly to spin up a website. And then good self-service content authoring tools that allow you to upgrade that. So that was the promise. That was what Canvas was supposed to offer. The reality, however, was not quite so pretty. The biggest issue that we faced was unsustainable customization. So the platform would have worked great if people did not want to customize, if the brands were willing to use, because built into Canvas was a theme, a Drupal theme. If people were willing to use that theme, it would have worked great. If people had been willing to use the capabilities out of the box without customizing them, it would have worked great. But people were not. And so things were customized, often in unsustainable ways. That is to say, people would make a customization, we would release a new version of the platform, it would break the sites that had been customized. Another big issue that we encountered was feature bloat. So as Eric said, over 500 community modules, thousands of lines of of custom code, a huge Drupal application with serious backend performance issues. If these were actually interactive sites, it would have been a major issue. As it is, it was 90% of the content is cacheable, so the performance issues are less visible to the end users, but it's still very expensive to run, very complex and difficult to maintain. And many, many markets don't need the things that it offers. Some do, some don't, but everybody has to take it all. And then the last thing is about operations. So the fact that it is so big and so interconnected and so monolithic meant that time to market was terrible, because when you made a change to the platform, you had no idea what was going to break. So you had to do extensive testing. You had to take into consideration all the possible ways that your change might play out through the monolith, which meant releasing new features. And also the cost of upgrading the platform under the existing sites was very high. And then the edit UI and the fact that, as I said, many changes to our websites involved both content and code, meant that the operational model on the day-to-day site level was also very poor, very expensive. We had terrible workflows in which people had to make content changes in one place, deploy code to that place, deploy it to a preview environment, preview it, and then redo everything on another environment. So the result of that experience, and I came into J&J sort of right at the time they were trying to operationalize this platform. And many of us, Eric, Heidi, Daniel, myself, have spent years working on, and Ali as well, years working on Canvas, the first platform. And we the learnings we took from that were a few core problems with the existing system. One of the most important was the workflow problem that I just mentioned, especially when the changes involved both code and content together. Second big problem was the content editor experience, which in Drupal 7 is not great and was made worse by the architectural decision to use panels for the websites. Lack of mature patterns for sustainable front-end customization. So that's a big one as well that I touched on before. People wanted to make the sites look different from one another, and there was no good way that there was no pattern that was part of the system that let them do that in a way that didn't run the risk of breaking when a site was upgraded. The other ones here, I think you probably, if you're familiar with JAMstack, are familiar with as arguments to move to that paradigm. The support and infrastructure costs are very high for hosting, large-scale monolithic PHP-based web applications like Drupal, and also the monolithic nature of the system, as I touched on before, makes it much harder to iterate quickly. And also, that's true for both core capabilities and also for marketers who usually also want to iterate quickly on their marketing ideas. So this leads us to some core concepts of Bodiless, or of what became Bodiless JS. I would say the first core concept here, which is probably also a core concept in many JAMstack paradigms, is this idea of vertical decoupling. Often you think of decoupling as horizontally, as the front end being decoupled from the back end, but we actually are shifting that. And I've seen this also described as a liquid framework, where instead of having a monolithic backend that talks to a monolithic front end via APIs, so they're decoupled from each other, but tightly coupled across the application, we look at having individual web components that may or may not be tightly coupled to their own backends, but are very decoupled from the components they sit alongside. And one of the corollaries of that for Bodiless JS is that those components in our model own their own data. So in a traditional CMS where you have a backend and a front end, a view and a model, the controller is responsible for translating the model to meet the needs of the view. In our situation, the view dictates the structure of its own data, and I'll get to that more when I talk about the data model. But essentially, the content in Bodiless JS is stored alongside the code in the repository as JSON files, and the structure of those JSON files are dictated by the individual components that use them. Another key concept in Bodiless, and actually I'll stop here for any of these, Eric or anyone else from the Bodiless team. If you have something you want to add, please do. Okay, composition is another key point in our model, specifically with regard to design. And I will get into this a little bit later on today, but we actually just merged the PR with the documentation for our design system. But the idea is that we want individual bits of design and also individual bits of functionality to be encapsulated as tokens, and that those can be applied and composed to form the final component. And we think that model, which is also kind of founded on the principles of atomic CSS, will lead to more sustainable customization. A third key principle is one workflow. So again, touching on what I said before about code and content together, we wanted to make it so that if you wanted to change your website, because also marketers tend not to be able to distinguish between what's code and what's content. That's kind of a developer's idea or a developer's distinction. So we wanted to make it so that if you want to change your website, your change goes through a single workflow from start to finish, including working on it, reviewing it, and publishing it. And then with regard to the UX for content editors, we wanted to err on the side of simplicity. There's kind of a continuum, I think, in content edit UIs between really complex ones that let you do everything but are very difficult to learn and understand, think Photoshop, and then very simple ones that don't let you do much but let you do it in an extremely intuitive way. And our philosophy is to err on that side and let developers do the complex things using the UX that they're familiar with, which is IDEs and code, right?
Hey, Chris, can I add one little anecdote on that one?
Yeah, please.
So one of the things that when we were hearing lots of, we were thinking about this next generation and we've been talking with lots of different solutions. And there's been all these solutions that have been talking about being able to control all of this stuff through the interface. And then we would start to talk about them about what the type of user you need for that. And eventually we hit on the fact that you basically needed somebody that knew JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And so you needed a developer to be able to do it, but then you were going to make the developer work inside the interface. And our thinking was like, developers would rather write code. So let's leave the stuff that needs a developer to code and try to keep the UX for things that don't require a high skill level to understand and execute.
Yeah, it's a great call out. Thanks. All right, moving along to the bodiless system architecture. So this is just an example of a JAMstack paradigm. It's probably a pretty basic one, but essentially we have a set of component libraries that house all the components in our system, and those are divided into global ones, brand level ones, and local ones. And there can be other ones as well. You could have a franchise library, for example, for skincare or self-care, which is what we call OTC. Then optionally, and I probably should have graded this out, you have some kind of a CMS to manage reusable content. As I said, we don't have a lot of content reuse. So we have this in the picture more as a forward-looking, we need to be able to accommodate this than as something integral to the system. The content, if you will, or the copy of websites, as you'll see, is treated as code. And that's how we achieve the workflow benefits that we're looking for. And then you have Bodiless Core, which is built essentially on Gatsby, although that's theoretically decoupleable from Gatsby. You could conceivably use a different static site generator if you want, which is where all those things are assembled to produce a website that is then deployed to a CDN. Dynamic content comes from collections of services. Those could be anything from the ratings and reviews service to pollen count service to identity management services, form data capture services, and first-party data is collected directly from the browser through the same service layer and sent to a CRM. So a fairly, I think, straightforward architecture for the JAMstack world. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those pieces in turn. So first, the component libraries. First, there's a global library, and that really is bodiless, right? So what you see here are bits of the bodiless edit UI. Those are encapsulated in components that you can use to build your website, as you see as we get to the second part of the evening. So the components that you would use to build a bodiless website are part of this global library. Then you might have a brand library, which has the design system for the brand in it, which basically takes the global components, composes them, adds design tokens for them that provide a style guide that you can then use. And then you might have a regional library or a lead market library where a particular capability is developed by one brand or one market, actually. For example, the North America market, one of the rich markets that's able to actually do this. They develop a capability like a pollen count widget, which is what you see here. And they make that available to other websites as well. Daniel, do you have anything you want to say about this? Or am I capturing that pretty well?
Oh, I think this captures it wonderfully.
Great. So what is the core of our system? And bear in mind that the core of this system includes Bodiless, but is not Bodiless. There's a lot more in this system than just Bodiless. What we have as the center for our system is a repository. As I said, code and content are all treated the same. They are managed in a Git repository. We use Bitbucket at J&J. We also have workflow tooling. And one of our principles that I didn't actually put as a core concept, but is definitely a core principle, is to let tools that already do something well do them rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So for workflow, rather than trying to build a workflow tool, which many CMSs do, we decided, well, there is a pretty good one out there, and it also happens to be the one that everybody at J&J uses. It's called Jira. Why don't we try and integrate with Jira, let Jira manage our workflow, and just find the points where we need to tie into it in order to achieve the actual workflow of the websites themselves. Then we have automation, which we're using Jenkins for, which is the glue that holds the repository, the workflow, and everything else together. It's not a huge amount of automation, but there is automation that we've built. We have a preview site. So one of the things that we wanted to be able to do is make it so that any change that you make to your website can be previewed in a unique and isolated environment that is a high fidelity reproduction of what that would look like on production. So essentially for every branch in that repository, we spin up an environment. Our current tooling uses platform.sh for this. It is definitely something that we are looking at, both using direct cloud providers like AWS, Azure, or GCP, or potentially something we would be interested in looking at Netlify for as well. We have a reporting system that is part of this as well. That's actually a Drupal application, a Drupal 8 application that keeps track of all of our site inventory, and is also used as a single source of truth for information about all our sites and where they are in these flows. And then finally, this is really the core of Bodiless. We have a site editor, which is a Gatsby-based system using the Bodiless core components to allow you to edit the JSON files for your site via a WYSIWYG web interface. Those are also hosted on platform.sh, one for every branch. But you can also instantiate them, as we will do tonight, locally. And it's exactly the same environment that you're using to edit locally that you would edit if you were editing it in the cloud. Probably don't need to say much about JAM sites to this group, but essentially the code and the content from your repository are assembled by a static site generator, in this case Gatsby, or as they call it, a progressive web app generator, into static HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that can then be deployed to a static environment, which sits behind a CDN. And again, as you know, the components that we have on the site to have JavaScript in them so they can talk to APIs. And if you have content that is truly dynamic that needs to be pulled into the browser, you can do it. We also favor the idea that not all content that you might think is dynamic actually is dynamic. So a good example of that is like an online retailer provider. We have a partner that provides online retailer information, which they update once a day. There's no reason that you need to pull that into the browser. So we are able to pull that into the build environment and rebuild it and redeploy the site. Again, pretty standard JAMstack stuff. The component libraries and core. So this is about how we use core to assemble components and content together into the actual website. So you have these component libraries, right, that we looked at before. And then you have the actual finished allergy count widget that we want to put on our websites. So it takes the editable, the library that allows you to edit from the global library, the rich text editor, combines it with the design system style guide, the secondary header, in order to give you an editable get your local allergy forecast header for this. It takes just the rich text editor and applies it to a text field there so that you can actually edit the text of that. It takes a button from the brand library and puts it on there. And then it takes the widget itself from the lead market library and applies the brand style guide to it in order to create a version of it that is styled in accordance with the brand style guide. So it's just an idea of how we use composition to build up the components on the site. So again, just I kind of touched on this, but the workflow is managed directly from Jira. So you create a Jira ticket when you want to make a change to your site. That spins up a new branch in Bitbucket, which in turn automatically through our automation and through platform.sh creates both a preview environment and an edit environment. The preview environment, the edit environment, you can really think of as a distributed cloud-based local development environment where the interface is the web page itself, and you'll see it later on. It's an editor for JSON files that happens to look like the web page. Then the developer, however, when changes that can't be made through the edit UI need to be made, pushes them to the same branch. They get deployed to the edit environment so that the content editor can see them. We actually are contemplating building tooling that improves that interaction even more, so that when an editor is doing something and says, "Oh, I need to have a widget that has everything that's on this, but has some different styling or has some different infographic or something that a developer would have to do," they could just click a button, mark it. It would create a ticket or a task for the developer who would then do it, push it, and have it available to them. Once that's done, every change that gets pushed to the repository also gets built to an isolated staging or UAT or preview environment, which is a hi-fi replica, as I said, of the production site. And then when done, the branch gets merged back to master and deployed to the live website.
So Chris, I would just want to add there that I feel like this is one of the biggest wins from using the JAMstack with Bodiless that I think we've captured, is that this ability to not worry about how many of these environments we have, right? Like we can have 50 of these environments going on, and the cost of that doesn't compare to having a single environment using on a traditional LAMP stack. So it really just opened up the possibilities of what we could do here by using a JAMstack pattern.
And also, this preview idea, I think, is worth repeating. Like, that's something that is very difficult to achieve in general in large-scale CMSs. They might let you preview one change in one part of the site, or maybe even some related changes, but it's very often not the case that they let you preview the whole site exactly as it will appear on production without publishing some part of it. And to allow you to have 2 or 3 of those different previews happening simultaneously, so that, because we often have the use case where there are several changes that are to be made to the site, and but they don't go out together. And in fact, the order in which they go out is unpredictable, because one may be hung up in a compliance review or something that prevents it from going out before the others. So we don't know what order they're going to go out in. We know they're independent, and we need to be able to preview them all exactly as they appear. That doesn't happen right now. What happens right now is we have a single staging environment that runs the Drupal site. All the changes to that site are pushed to that staging environment together, and then they cherry pick commits and redo content edits in production in order to move just a piece of it to the production website. And it's not that you can't do those things or some of those things in CMSs. You know, there's tooling built around Drupal that allows you to stage content and deploy content from one instance to another, but they're very complex, and there are always edge cases where they break. And this model, it's simple because it's all just, again, letting tools do what they're good at. It lets Git do all of that for you. And Git is very good at managing revisions. And it has It's very good at traceability. It's very good at reverting things to a known point. It has a lot of things that problems that it has solved for developers, and we're just trying to take those problems and adapt them. And we're not alone in this, right? Like people at Forestry have been doing this. Tina CMS is built on the same paradigm. So that's all I have from a talk perspective. I guess I'll open it up for questions now before we dive into the coding, and maybe we want to take a little break after that.
Can you talk a little bit about your deployment process, and are you using a CDN?
We are. So our deployment, so first of all, let me, as a caveat, say that none of these websites are in production yet. This is a new technology and a new pattern that is still under evaluation. We've done a few pilot sites, but none of them have actually gone to production. That said, our deployment system, currently we're using platform.sh as our hosting partner. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. They have a lot of the deployment workflow built in particular this feature branch-based workflow that we've adopted. So when you push code to a feature branch on platform.sh, it's automatically deployed. We have a pair of apps, the static app, which is basically just serving static HTML content, and the edit app, which is running this lightweight node backend, which enables our editing, and running Gatsby develop. So that's our deployment. The CDN that's in front of that, there's 3 options that we have on the table. One of them is just plain CloudFront. One of them is Fastly, which is bundled with platform.sh. And then we also have a J&J and enterprise contract with, I'm blanking on the name. What's our CDN?
Cloudflare.
Cloudflare, thank you, Cloudflare. CloudFront, Cloudflare, Brightspot, Brightcode, there's too many things that all sound alike. Cloudflare, which can also be used if we need really advanced CDN capabilities and or WAF, because the WAF is built into Cloudflare.
Thanks.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just curious how you had that set up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's just, I don't want to get too much into how we made the hosting decisions we made, because they're very much decisions by committee. Suffice it to say, we are investigating alternatives. Other questions?
Hey, Chris, this is Jeff. Is the workflow the same for code changes and content changes? Because it seems like there's a potential there for conflicts between or trying to reconcile between updates to content and updates to code. So
until content is brought from an external CMS, which is something, as I said, that we're prepared for, but have not yet implemented because we don't really have those use cases. Yes, the content is essentially treated as code. It's stored as JSON files. So the workflow is exactly the same for code and content. In terms of merge conflict possibilities, you know, there's not going to be a merge conflict between the code that is written by a developer and the content that's edited by a content editor, because one is in, you know, JavaScript files or TypeScript files and the other's in JSON files. So they're not touching the same files. You might have merge conflicts if somebody has made a content change, say on a different branch that was released to production while you were working on yours, and it touches the same part of the page. We've broken the content files down to the component level. As I said before, components own their own data. So every component on the page, like that, a header component has its own JSON file that has the content for that header. So unless they're touching the exact same things on the page, they're unlikely to be merge conflicts. If there are merge conflicts, either, depending on how often they occur and how severe they are, you just call up your developer and say, hey, there's a merge conflict, can you fix it? And you use standard Git tools for fixing your merge conflict. Or we are planning, we haven't implemented this yet, but we're planning a mechanism which is similar. I don't know how many of you have worked with PowerPoint online, where you can both work on slides. And if you change a slide and someone else changes the same slide, it'll give you an option to say, which slide do you want? Do you want the one that you're working on or the one that someone else worked on? So kind of a page-wise merge conflict resolution, which lets you choose which version you want to go with. And then you have to either redo your changes or redo someone else's changes.
Hi, this is Nick. Could you overview your plans for testing, either content testing or just architectural testing of the system?
Sure. So we are endeavoring to write unit tests for all the Bodiless core components. We're probably at about 50%, maybe a little bit less in terms of the real testable things. We're also in the process of using Cypress to run end-to-end browser-based tests of core Bodiless functionality. So that's the testing that we're looking at for Bodiless itself. For our sites, that is a much more complex problem. We have in the past used a tool internally developed at J&J called Hyperion, which is a Selenium-based testing program. It also makes use of Applitools eyes to do visual-based testing between kind of before or after. So we will probably use some version of that. The issue that we have had in the past with that is that it generates many, many false positives. And so the triage time for those test results can be very high. So it's something that we're still working on the perfect solution for testing site upgrades. Our hope here is because of the vertically decoupled nature of this and because the components are what you can do when you change a component is extremely limited in scope. We're hoping that we're able to do a lot more focus testing on site upgrades because we'll know that only something that is used in point X has changed, or conversely, only something that's used in the header has changed, and the header is the same on every page and is separate from the content of the page. So we only have to test it on one or two pages. But that is all something that we need to work out in more detail. I would say that doing that for Canvas, for our Drupal platform, and figuring out how to make upgrades work has been the bulk of what my pain has been about in the past 2 or 3 years. Well, I guess more, 5 years. So it's a subject that's very close to my heart, like a dagger. Does that answer your question, or do you want to follow up?
No, very much so, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
One more question. You said you have all your content in JSON. Is there a reason you're not using Markdown?
So that's the main reason is that we don't expect people to be editing the JSON directly, right? What we're creating here is a content editing experience that doesn't involve editing the file directly, but allows you to edit it through the web interface. So there was no real need for Markdown. It's something we've considered, though, as a possibility for our rich text fields at any rate.
But in also, so this is Eric, sorry. I'd also say that usually when you're storing some interpretation of HTML, and our JSON files are not trying to store HTML, right? They're trying to store a data model for the components. So we would basically be trying to parse the Markdown into a data format. Like when we discussed, we were looking at early solutions, we realized a lot of times when we were going to use a solution that had Markdown, we ended up having most of the data would end up in the head of the Markdown file and not actually be Markdown.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Other questions?
I think we can move on to the hands-on.
All right, cool. Does anybody want to take a couple of minutes break before we start? Or actually, maybe the thing to do is to go through the install step, because that will enforce a couple of minutes break probably, and then and then we can do a thing then. Okay, so I'm going to assume to start out with that everyone already has Node installed and has all the prerequisites ready. If anyone doesn't, you probably are going to have difficulty catching up. So the first thing to do is, so we're creating an actual Gatsby starter is on our roadmap, but we haven't actually done it yet. So instead, the easiest way to get started here is actually to clone our monorepo. can post this into the chat if you don't have it. Let's see, how do I do that here? How do I find the chat window now? On the more? Chat, there it is.
On the bottom, you can see a button.
Yeah, I got it. I don't have the button on the bottom because I'm presenting.
Screen sharing, it's at the top.
So anyway, there is the repo. So the easiest thing to do is just to start out with is and then just do setup. So we're using, while this is going, I'll just talk a little bit about it. We're using Lerna to manage a monorepo. There's quite a bit of tweaking that setup took in order to manage dependencies properly. So we do not do just npm install on it because we had issues. That's why you need to run bootstrap. So this is bootstrapping the dependencies and building the packages. We use TypeScript in our project. It's not a requirement, obviously, if you want to use our libraries, but we encourage it.
It is also worth noting that, like, for this tutorial, we're going to use the example site, which is inside of the monorepo.
That's actually not true, Eric.
Oh, it's not?
No.
Oh, I take it all back then.
The change was in the latest PR that was just merged seconds before we started.
Ugh. Tricked me. All right. Well, I guess the point I was trying to get to is that you don't need to have all of the code from Lerna to run Bodiless. If you start with the sample site, it'll include the packages from npm.
Right.
This is just an easier way of running the demo. But I should stop talking.
Basically, to start with the starter kit, you need to do this in order to get the tooling that lets you run new at the moment. So that's why actually being able to use just Gatsby new is on our roadmap. Because our starter kit is in our monorepo, and Gatsby new doesn't support that, we need to build tooling that will copy it from its subdirectory in the monorepo to its own standalone repository so that you can then just run Gatsby new to create your site. But our new, which will be running in a second, does essentially that. Yeah, so one of the liabilities of Lerna is that the hoisting process, which we do, is a little bit time consuming. And if you have questions about this, I guess the best thing to do is to post them in the chat. And Eric, Duan, Ivan, Ali, if you guys are keeping an eye on the chat and can answer, and then let us know if you need a breakout room to help people solve the questions. You see now it's building the Tailwind theme. I don't know how familiar you are with Tailwind. As I said, we use atomic CSS paradigm in our styling. I would say we're fairly opinionated in terms of the way we think you should do your site building. And one of our opinions is that atomic CSS is a great paradigm. We use it for our administration UI, and we also have kind of built the utilities for site styling that we have built around that paradigm. Okay, so now if you want to create a new site, you just do npm run new, and then give it a path to where you want it to create its new site. And it'll do essentially what Bodiless what Gatsby new does. It'll create a repository for you. It'll copy over the starter kit, which is basically just a Gatsby starter, and it'll run npmi. So that's what this is doing now. So this is doing what Eric said. This is actually installing the packages from npm, the bodiless packages themselves. We do have a utility that lets you package the ones from the master branch or from whatever branch you're working on in the monorepo, but we're not using that right now. If anyone has questions while we're waiting, please feel free to ask them. Eric told me I should have you all do this before we started to save time, but I didn't listen.
Well, at some point we can probably make sure everybody's together. You know.
Yep, absolutely.
I see mine is taking a while to install.
Yeah, one of the things that I think takes some time, here you see it's downloading Chromium. So one of the tools that we have here, which I'm not going to demo today, but you can read about, is a site flattening tool. Basically, one of our use cases is to take our existing sites and flatten them in order to, because they're either they don't get content updates very often, or they're just too expensive to host and maintain the way they are. They should just be flattened. So we built a tool that will flatten the site into a Gatsby site. It basically creates ginormous components that are the body of each page, but it at least puts the site into, it translates the site to JSX and it puts it into the Gatsby framework so that you can then build it. Oh, we're done. How are people doing in terms of their install? Close to being done? You can wait a little bit, or maybe take a few minutes break and then start over.
Yeah, let's take a bio break.
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break and come back at like 7:45.
Does everyone want to click on the yes when you are working, when you're up?
That's a great idea. Does everybody see that? I think you have to click on participants to see it.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So 7:45. Is that good? That's 7 minutes. Is that too long?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I'll be back 7:45. Or actually, I'll just hang out if people have questions. If anybody wants to chat.
Well, hey Chris, that site flattening tool, is that open source?
It is. It's part of the Bodiless package. It's called Bodiless Migration, I think. Let me see.
Oh, okay.
So it'll take a site, flatten it. It obviously, it's not perfect. There are things that you have to do. There's often some remediation that has to be done after the flattening, but we found that it works.
Yeah.
It works reasonably well. It works as well as like the thing that we compared it to is httrack. And it definitely works as well as httrack. And it has the advantage that built into it is the ability to specify selectors of parts of the page that you want removed. So for example, if you're flattening a site that has search, you can just take out the search box on all pages by specifying that selector. It also will componentize parts of the page, again, based on selectors. So if you say, oh, I want the header and the footer to be extracted as individual components, it can do that. And then it'll build the pages using those components as the header and the footer so that you're a step ahead if you want to make a change, site-wide change to the header or the footer. Also, because it does convert the site to JSX, it does let you then go in, and we call this sort of progressively rehydrating. It'll let you go in and say, all right, I want to change this page to be editable. And so I'm going to change the contents of these elements to use the Bodiless editors so that a content editor can then go in and edit those parts of the page. So you can progressively take your site from pure static to partially editable.
That is really awesome.
Well, I think it remains to be seen how it sounds really awesome. I was really excited about it when we started developing it. It remains to be seen whether the use cases exist for that, really. So I'll get back to you in another 6 months to see whether anybody really wants to do that. It has some problems, right? Like, especially if you're going to rebuild, you have to worry about CSS bleed from the original site. We have issues with CSS bleed to our admin UI that we have to address. And also, like, if people are going to flatten their site, can they really predict which parts of it they want to be editable? That's what I'm not sure about.
Right.
But I think it might work for, if you want, for example, take an existing site and then say, I want to add some campaign pages to it. Then it might work to make those campaign pages editable, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's very interesting. I mean, I actually just never really thought about flattening a site in that context. I mean, you know, we've always gone to just some kind of flat HTML thing.
Right. Right.
And you said, I don't know if we should be chatting about stuff. Maybe I should wait, but I'll bring it up now. Maybe we can bring it up again later if you all think, you know, I don't know who may or may not be here, but you had mentioned when you were in your presentation about some of the existing tools that have similar ways of being as what you've created here. And did you feel, you don't have to diss on any of those tools or anything, but did you feel like you wanted to just create it from scratch to create your own world, or you know, your own way of being? Or? I
would say bear in mind that we started this project 2 years ago. So some of the existing tools didn't exist at the time that we started. Like Tina CMS, very, very new. And Tina CMS is probably the closest in spirit to what we're doing in terms of the way it manages content and code together and builds a web-based editor that's part of the site. You know, when we started, there was Netlify CMS existed, but it was not in place WYSIWYG editing. It was form-based editing, and we wanted to do WYSIWYG editing. Some get-back CMSs existed, like Forestry existed, but it didn't have the edit part built in. There were some editors, like one that we actually came quite close to using was Ori. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ori editor, but it's a WYSIWYG React-based editing framework. But we decided that it didn't have the data flow that we wanted, and this document model was not exactly what we wanted. We really wanted to split components into their own, so the components manage their own data, and the Ori data model was more, you know, editor-based, where you had a single large region of the page that could have a lot of things on it. And Ori also had a very different, at the time we started, not mature layout management system, wasn't responsive. So we were like, oh, well, we're gonna have to fix that problem. So that's one of the reasons we didn't go with that. So there were lots of bits and pieces, and people were doing this kind of thing, but we didn't actually find anything that was exactly what we wanted to do.
Interesting. Yeah.
We looked at web components-based things like hacks, but we decided we wanted to do React. So it's just, you know.
And so you have all of these sites, and it sounds like they're all relatively small sites themselves.
Yes, I would say our biggest site is 200 pages.
Okay. So build times and that sort of thing is not a consideration.
Not a consideration for us at this point, although, you know, we would love to have incremental builds.
Oh yeah, that's a holy grail. That's everybody's goal.
But for us, build times are not huge at the moment, and the sites aren't big. So
do you cache all of these files in your CI so that you don't have to go through this 15-minute setup every time?
We do. We do. Essentially, in our CI, we have the master branch, which has everything installed, and then we use that as the basis for the next npm install. So it's quicker. The problem is that for the mono repo, Lerna, even if you cache everything, does not, it still redoes the hoist. There's not an easy way to tell Lerna, nothing has changed, don't do this. So it's something that we need to work on, but it's not something that would affect a site. Our sites on CI actually build quickly, a minute or two with the NPM packages cached. It's really when you're trying to build the platform, to do platform development, that we have slow build times, and that's something that we need to work on. We also have issues, I would say, that we are working on relating to Gatsby develop rebuilds. We've been hammering at that problem for a while. I think it's also one, I don't know, is anybody from the Gatsby team on the call?
No, but if, no. I don't
know. Anyway, it seems like one that they have been hammering on as well. There's been a lot of activity in that area of optimizing their builds, and particularly the builds that they do during Gatsby develop. We had one upgrade where a single change would, because if we do a revert, we're changing a lot of files, and that was triggering a lot of Gatsby rebuilds in develop, which would cause the edit environment to go down for a while. And then there was a Gatsby upgrade where that problem just went away. And so I think they're working on this as well. I would love to actually get together with them, and because I suspect that their Gatsby preview tooling uses similar methodology, but I don't know. They have some secret sauce too, I'm sure.
Yeah,
they're not disclosing.
Kyle Matthews is in the new Dynamic Slack. So.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to join that one. All right, we're at 7:45.
Yep.
Everybody caught up? Everybody ready to move on?
I think we have to move on.
All right, let's move on. So just to get it started, you run npm start. And that starts the Gatsby develop server, and essentially that, wait a minute, am I in the wrong, I might be in the wrong place. It looks like it's doing too many things.
I don't think you switched over to the site, Chris.
Did I didn't switch over to the site, that's the problem. Okay. Let's skip that. That's what I did. Now, let's try it there. Did I installed the site though, right? Yeah.
You did?
I think I did. It's part of the new, yeah. Yeah, so switch over to the site before you run npm start. Sorry about that. And this is building and creating the Gatsby site. And if you're familiar with Gatsby, it will serve it on localhost 8000. And there's your basic Bodiless landing page. I won't go into this edit UI too much. Feel free to play with it. Part of our goal is to make a zero documentation editor experience. Again, that's a holy grail, but our idea is that these things should be as self-explanatory as possible. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new page. And we're going to do this two ways. We're going to do it manually using as a developer would, and then we're also going to do it using the UI the way a content editor might. So the first thing that you would do, basically every page on your site is a directory in the site, and we move those into a source/data/pages. So go to source/data/pages in your new site, and then create a directory. You'll see that that triggered a rebuild here. And if you now go to it's not there. Well, let's do what we're supposed to do, which is actually create a file in that directory. So the way I usually do this is this way. And then I'm just going to grab, probably the easiest way for you all to follow along is also to cut and paste code from the demo. It's this is the URL. I'll put it in the Zoom chat. It's under the site build basics. And this is our basic index page. And there's nothing special about this index page. It's really a pretty standard Gatsby index page. There's a couple of things to point out, but let's get this actually displaying. There we go. So there's our index page. You create a directory and put an index file in there. The index file itself, if you don't want to use TypeScript, you don't have to, but you'd have to strip out all the type information. A couple of things to look at that make this different from your standard Gatsby page. This page component. So that's the wrapper that has all of the Bodiless secret sauce in it. So you need to make sure your whole page is wrapped in it. And then these queries, if you're familiar with Gatsby, the way Gatsby models data is through a GraphQL abstraction layer. And these are the GraphQL queries that actually bring in the JSON files for this particular page. The fragments that are defined here are part of Bodiless, so you just need to make sure that you have a query that uses those fragments. And there's two. There's one for the data that pertain just to the particular page that you're working on, and there's another one for data that is site-wide. But other than that, aside from this page component and the queries, this is pretty much vanilla Gatsby. Questions about that? Okay, so the first thing that we will do to this page to make it more Bodiless-like is style the header using our design paradigm. So if you go back here, basically our, I won't create a page from the UI. I'll show you on the thing here. There is a button that you can use to create a page from the UI as well. It'll use a default template for that page, but you would still have to, at this point, go in and create the index file manually. It's primarily useful if you have a page that has a lot of children who all use the same template. You can specify a template for the children of that page, and then it'll create a child's. Our classic use case is a product listing page that has a lot of children that are products. You can use that to very quickly create a product from the UI. So we use we recommend using functional CSS or atomic CSS and design tokens to style your site. And there's a whole, the topic is much broader than I really want to cover here. There is a really good description of it that was just merged to our documentation. Whether it actually is shown up or not, I'm not 100% sure. Let me see if it's actually there. No, it hasn't redeployed yet. But it will be there soon. But anyway, the idea is, if you're not familiar with what a design token is, it is a reusable piece of design, not exactly a component, but more like often a font or a color or or something else that is a small piece of design that can be applied to components across your site. We've taken that idea and run with it to use this notion of a token as the fundamental unit of functionality as well as design on your site. And what we're going to do, we express those tokens as React higher order components. So here, and this is the package that does this, is this Bodiless F classes package. So we're going to take that code and drop it in here. And we're going to take two tokens that are defined and put them in here as well. So here you see, this is using Tailwind, which is built into the starter, because that's how we, again, recommend. If you're not familiar with atomic or functional CSS, I'll try and give you a very quick overview. It uses utility classes for styling rather than the traditional CSS cascade. And the classes are atomic in the computer science term, in that that class will always have the same effect wherever it's applied. So rather than applying classes that are used essentially as selectors on your HTML elements, you apply classes that carry styling along with them. And then usually you use a library of some sort. We use Tailwind to generate the CSS for those classes. So here we're applying some classes that carry, and the classes are very expressive of what they do, right? This is saying text 3 times normal size and font bold. So we're applying that, but instead of applying it directly to the component, we're creating this token as primary header that says primary headers have this kind of styling, right? And this add classes in H1, these are built into this F classes package. They're just utilities that let you easily manipulate these classes. So H1 is just a version of the H1 tag that allows you to call add classes on it. So we are creating this as primary header token here, and this primary header component. And now we're just going to replace our H1 with a primary header. Save that. And reload the page, because for some reason HMR is not working in some cases for us. It's a newly discovered bug. But now you see the styling that we just applied is now applied to the header of this page. And we've embodied it in this as primary header token, which can now be used anywhere on your site as a way of saying, this is how a primary header should look. Questions about that?
And I would say in general, sorry, this is Eric. I would say in general, we try to think of those tokens as our unit of reuse. So instead of applying it to an H1 and then reusing the primary header, we would reuse the as primary header, right, across the site.
Right. So again, we would go into this in more detail if we were going to dive into the design system, but the pattern would not be to export this primary header component. It would be to export this as primary header HOC and use that where you wanted to use it on your site. So now we have styled that. Now let's get into the meat of the Bodiless editing system. So we're going to make something editable. So as I mentioned before, the Bodiless library, the core library, contains components and HOCs which allow you to make your basic elements editable. And then you build your site by taking those components and composing them. And that's really what this tutorial is about, composing them to form more complex components that are editable because they inherit the editability of their constituent pieces. So we'll take this HOC, this as editable HOC from Bodiless components, and we'll take flow from Lodash because that's how we do our composition. And we're going to rewrite our primary header to be editable. So we're really, if you look at what the primary header looks like now, it's just calling as primary header on H1. What we're going to do here is still call as primary header, but we're also going to add this editability to it. So we're just adding one more piece of functionality, composing one more piece of functionality onto this basic H1. Why is it yelling at me?
You removed the wrong thing.
I removed the wrong thing. There we go. So now, if we reload the page, actually, in this case, we didn't have to reload it. So why the HMR was broken the first time, I'm not sure. Something to be investigated. So now you see the thing that it said before is gone because this is now editable. So now I can go in here and I can type whatever I want. And if I reload the page, you'll see it's also editable. I can take us out of edit mode here, and now it's not editable. So this is more like a preview of the actual site. It's not a full-on preview as we would have if we generated the static site, but it's more like it. Go back into edit mode. So what's actually going on here? So we have, when we started our application, we started Gatsby develop. That's what's serving the site. We also started a small back-end node application whose responsibility is pretty much to accept posts of content from the browser and save them to JSON files on the disk. So if I now go back to my, why don't I do it here, to my page, you'll see there's now a title.json file on my page that was created. And if I look at it, you'll see it has the text, right? And I can also actually make changes here directly. Save that, and you'll see that that content was HMR'd to the page. And in fact, it's near, I'm going to say near simultaneous. So if I take this and I make some changes here, oops, probably easier to do it the other way. If I make some changes here, you'll see they're getting saved and read into the other browser window. So it's not Google Docs, but it has the ability to make changes and at least preview them in real time by someone else in another browser window. Questions about this? You'll notice that when I placed this, when I gave it as editable, I gave it two parameters here. One of them, this first one is what we call a node key. So the second one is a placeholder. So if I were to delete the text here, a placeholder shows up. The first one is what we call a node key, and that's actually, essentially, it's the title, it's the name of the JSON file to use. Our data model is that components manage the structure of their own data. Bodiless manages where their data gets stored. So every component gets a prop, basically, that is, this is where you should store your data. And it can then read and write freely from that. And Bodiless will take care of serializing that. You could, in fact, write a plugin that serialized that to a database instead of serializing it to JSON files if you felt like it. That is abstracted from the component. So the component doesn't know anything about the data storage mechanism. It just says, it just knows, oh, I've got a slot, I've got a box, I can put my data in it. Bodiless takes care of all of that, but Bodiless doesn't know anything about the structure of the data inside that box. The component knows about the structure. So the structure of this JSON file is defined by that as editable component. So next, everybody, anybody need additional help or want me to, or have a question?
I just have a question. It's not actually code related, but I'm just a little curious about the workflow that you mentioned. Someone, an end user, I guess somebody in marketing or whatever, would open a Jira ticket.
Yes.
And from there, would they then get some sort of access? So there's a staging branch maybe created. They have access to edit content, and do they make an appointment with the developer? They're like working hand in hand to.
Yeah. So yes to all of the first part of that. They would create a Jira ticket. The automation kicks in and creates an edit environment for that, specifically for that Jira ticket, as well as a preview environment specifically for that Jira ticket, and posts the URL back to the ticket. The marketer or whoever content editor clicks that URL, goes to the edit environment. They log in. We have a module which is not open source, which is a J&J SSO module, basically, that allows them to log in with their J&J credentials that Ali, who's on the line, wrote. That then they're logged in, and so we know who they are, and they can now start making changes to that. And if and when they need help from a developer, what the actual process workflow for that interaction is TBD. Maybe they create a subtask on the Jira ticket and the developer picks it up. Maybe they Skype the developer, or Skype is our, I just gave away that that's our current internal communication tool. Maybe they hit up the developer on Teams, which we're also trying to migrate to, or maybe they call a developer, or maybe they're sitting next to the developer and they say, hey, I need you to create this thing for me. So there's a lot of different ways that interaction could go that are more business process related than technology related. But at that point, what they would do, if what they needed from the developer required their content changes, then they would hit this. It's grayed out here because I'm not on a branch that allows it, but they would hit this upload button, and that would push their changes back to Git, so the developer could pull those changes. So they would interact with the developer from a technology standpoint the same way any two developers working on the same feature branch would interact. One would push their changes to the feature branch, the other would pull them, make some other changes, push them to the feature branch, and then the content editor could pull them into the edit environment.
Cool. That's neat. Thank you.
Yeah. So next thing on the agenda. Yeah.
I just want to clarify the workflow integration with Jira and our tooling, that is not part of Bodiless, right? The pattern is something that we're trying to discuss, but it's very specific to the tooling that we're actually using inside J&J. And so it didn't feel like it would be helpful to open source that part of the project.
The Jira integration in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
The Git integration, however, is so you can configure your local machine, or because we have built the platform.sh integration, you can configure a platform.sh environment to pull and push from either GitHub or Bitbucket. And so you can, that part of the collaboration where the developer pushes changes to the branch and the content editor pulls them in, that's all part of the open source. It's just the Jira piece that's not.
It's not, yes.
Okay, so next we're going to move on to editing things other than text, images and links. So here we're going to pull, so this Bodiless components package, hopefully that is enough. This Bodiless components package has the building blocks of a Bodiless site. So it has a rich text, actually it doesn't, the rich text editor is in its own package. It has a basic editable, which in this case is just content editable, no rich text, what we added here. It has an image, it has a link. It has now menus and lists and some other basic things that you could use as building blocks for your site. So here we're bringing in the image and the link. Again, you'll notice that we're bringing them in not as components, but as higher order components. So once again, this pattern that the unit of reuse in Bodiless is a HOC, it's not a component. And now at the point of use, we're actually going to create our images and our links. And then we are going to put them in. Where are we putting them? Above the primary header. So this ESLint thing is just because, it may not even be necessary. It's because the link or the image, no, the link is supposed to have some accessibility markup on it that we don't have because it's actually in the A tag itself, not in the link component, and somehow it knows about that. So that's why we are telling the linter, we know about this.
I have a quick question, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed that you're adding these higher order components.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if this is actually feasible because I haven't looked, but have you considered using like a JSX AST parser and instead, essentially creating the components without having to manually create them? So you parse out the actual files for the JSX?
I'm not sure I know exactly what it is that you're talking about.
Okay, that's probably a longer discussion. I'll ping you after.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea here is that we want to be able to compose the HOCs.
Mm-hmm.
So if what you're talking about is a alternative that allows the similar kind of composition, I'm definitely all ears.
Okay.
But we did not want to do it by writing JSX. We wanted to do it by writing. By being able to flow all of these components together. There's nothing that stops you, by the way, from taking this primary header and using it elsewhere on your site if you prefer that pattern. But we wanted to make the thing that you use on your site the HOC rather than the component itself, to allow you to recompose them, those tokens essentially, at the point of use to give you the thing that you wanted. Probably if you wanted to reuse all of these things a lot, like just as primary header, that's where you might make the choice to say, I'm going to export this primary header and just use it everywhere, rather than composing them.
Cool.
So now I think that's all I need to do. Right. So now I have a placeholder image there, right? This is now an editable image. So if I click on it, you'll see I actually get two buttons now. One of them was contributed by the link component, and the other was contributed by the image component. So the image is just a straight image uploader. Let's see if I have any good images that I can upload. add one. Let's see. This one. So now I've uploaded that image. And if you look at the JSON file now for that, so first of all, you'll see that there's now a hero link hero image.json file. And I'll get to the $ in a minute for that. And you see it now has that in. If I want to edit that image and actually add alt text, I can do that here. And now that image has alt text. Similarly, if I wanted to make this a linkable image, I can put the URL for my link in here. And now if I go out of edit mode and I click on this image, it will take me to foo.com, which doesn't exist. When I'm in edit mode, this image will not link out. It just brings up the buttons for editing the image. So again, what we've done here is we've actually composed a component here. We've composed a component that is a linkable image, and we've done it using these two primitives, as bodiless link and as bodiless image. Questions, comments before I move on?
Oh, hi, Chris. I'm Marco. I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi. For the editable part, creating a new component, the editable interface is reusable for new components. So, for example, creating a complex component that has a link and image, it's possible to make it editable and reuse the user interface already created.
Yes, yes. So the user interface is essentially all contained in these as bodiless link and as bodiless image. So Bodiless provides tools, and I probably won't get to that, but it provides a framework that lets you easily generate an edit interface. So I can just show you what the code for as bodiless link looks like. It's essentially a long list, again, of composed higher order components.
Hey,
right?
Okay, yep, clear. Yeah.
So it encapsulates all of that edit UI, and you can apply that to a link anywhere you want to.
But the other direction is also true, right, Chris? That like if I have a larger component that's like a product call out or something like that, right? I can apply those HOCs to different parts of that call out, and then I'll have a bigger component that I can then pass around that is editable.
Yes, and in fact, that we get to that later on in this demo if we have a chance to get to it, because we're going to build a composite component that has editable pieces. And the thing that you create there, you can create a component that is you can pass around that is editable, or you can create an HOC which can be applied to components of that type in order to make them editable, which allows you to say you have a larger thing, like say you have a image link, and in some places you want it to be editable, and in other places you don't want it to be editable, which is a reasonable use case, right? It's what you want to expose to your content editors may vary depending on what you're doing. This allows you to create a version of it that is editable and a version of it that's not editable just by applying or not applying the as editable component to it, HOC to it.
Nice.
So
Thank
moving
you.
on. Yeah, sure. Moving on. Let's talk about site level data. So if you notice, all of the data that we have used so far are stored in JSON files in this gallery page directory, right? And that's fine, but for things that go in the header of your site, you may actually not want to have to enter them on every page. So in order to accommodate that, we have this notion of site level as well as page level data. So what we'll do here is we're going to go in and look at this footer component that's part of the site. Right? And here you'll see we have a standard copyright notice. So we're going to make this copyright notice editable. We're going to add our editable here. This should probably be importing as editable. Right?
No, well, I think Chris, there's a limitation to as editable, which is why we have to use a component, because you want to use a collection. And we can't do that yet in the HOC.
Oh, you can't do that in the HOC yet? Okay. So
that was my fault.
Uh-huh. So now, instead of having this in here, we're going to take this bit of code and we're going to put it here. So what you'll notice here is that we're adding a node key, which we did before. That's what we did when we added the as editable. That first parameter was a node key, which is essentially saying, look here for your data. But we're also adding a node collection. So by default, the node collection is the node collection is the page or the node collection of whatever the parent is. In this case, we're saying here, store your data at this location, but in the site data directory, not in the page data directory. So if we now open our page again, you'll see that the copyright has gone away and now it says copyright notice. So I can put in here this is the favored casing, right? I can put that there. And now you'll see there is not a new file here, but there is a new file here. And there it has our content. And that is actually used on every page. So if I now go back to the home page, you'll see that my content is the same on the home page. So that's how we manage site level data. And at this point, there are only two collections. There's the page and the site. There would be nothing stopping you. We haven't found a use case for this yet, but there'd be nothing stopping you from adding another collection that had data that was shared, for example, on a subset of pages. So for example, if you had a different footer on one set of pages than on another set of pages, you could store the data for that footer in one collection and the data for the footer that's on another set of pages in a different collection. That's not a lot different from storing that data in two places in the same site collection. So that's why we haven't actually found a use case for it. The main thing is whether the data are shared, in which case it goes in the site, or specific to the individual page, in which case it goes in the page collection. Okay, I'm going to stop there and take the temperature of the room to see if people want me to continue for a little bit into some of the next topics, or this is enough of a taste. You can always, all of this, I'm basically, as you see, going through the online tutorial that already exists. So if you want to go further and you're tired and feel like ending the meeting now, I'm happy to do that. But if people would like to stay on and have me go through a couple more things, I can. Or if people have questions.
Maybe we can get a few people in to hop in and ask a question or say something. Pretty quiet crowd here this evening. Anyone? So quiet.
I have no question, but I would be interested to see the managing layout part.
Okay. We can definitely, well, whether we can actually skip ahead to that easily, I'm not sure, because there's a lot, everything builds on itself. What I can do.
Do you have a finished project that you can use?
Yeah, let me see if actually the
homepage has it.
Does it?
Yeah. Those touts are all in a.
They are?
Yes. Oh no, they're not. I'm sorry.
They are on the demo site, but they're not on the starter. But yeah, I could go back. I could do it. I can do it from the
demo site.
From the monorepo. Yeah. So now it's going to do all the things that it did before to load the actual example site. So within our monorepo, we have two example sites. One is the starter, which is what you would use to build a site yourself. And then the other is the demo site. Sorry, not the demo site, the test site, which is what we actually use to test and also serves as an example of the use of a variety of our components, including the layout manager. Now, while this is building, I'll just say about the layout manager. Calling it a layout manager is probably giving it more credit than it deserves. It is a way of placing components on a page, changing the width of those components and the order of those components. And it is nothing more than that. So with that, you can create some layouts. You can do some basic layout work, but it's not a way to create a complex layout. And again, part of our philosophy there is that if you are creating a complex layout, you probably need to have some developer experience to understand the repercussions of what you're doing for a responsive page. And also just to understand, you know, how to make it good. And so as long as you probably need developer experience to do that, why not let a developer use actual code to do that, which is probably she's going to be happier with than using some point and click interface. So this is our test site. And here, as Eric said, what just happened?
So you weren't in edit mode, I don't think, Chris.
Oh, I clicked a link. That's what I
did. Yes.
Yeah, we recently made the change that it defaults to not being in edit mode when you load it, which I objected to. But
now you're proving why.
Now I'm proving why I objected to it. So now it's in edit mode. And you see these things have little, what do you call them? Handles on them. So you can drag them around. You can also resize them. Where do I have to go? Oh, there we go.
You have to click on it. You have to activate it, Chris. Yeah, there you go.
So I can resize them. They snap to a grid that we've defined. As they get too big, it's just a flex box, right? So as they get too big, it's a flex box with wrap. So as they get too big, they flop over to the next size. I can make them smaller so they'll now fit on the same page. I can delete one of them. I can add one. And this is something that's worth commenting. So a lot of systems where you can place components on the page give you an interface to customize or configure that component, change colors, change orientations, add, remove pieces of the component. Some big screen that has a lot of options, a lot of checkboxes and stuff like that. What we've decided to do instead of that, rather than making these components configurable via the UX, we make them selectable and provide a search tool that allows you to find the one you want. So these are touts, right? All these different things that you could add here are different kinds of touts. So if I want to say, oh, I want, first of all, there are some things that aren't touts, so I'm going to limit it to touts.
Hey, Chris, it might be easier to see you doing this if you change so there's more on the page.
Oh, can I still do that?
Yeah.
Right, so here's all these different things, right? Actually, let's compromise.
Okay.
So I can say I just want the touts, and then touts have different orientations, right? Some of them are vertical, some are more horizontal. So let's say this is going to go in a smaller space, so a horizontal tout doesn't work. So I will pick a vertical tout. So that limits it to this. And let's say the tout that I want doesn't actually have a call to action. So I can here in the tout structure, I can say, I want all the ones that have no call to action. Right? And now I have the choices that are available to me that match those constraints. And I can say, okay, I want this one with the title and the body, but no call to action. And add that to my page. They come in right now by default at full width. That's configurable. So you can make them come in smaller. So now I have a tout with vertical image call to action in the right hand rail. I can move that to the left rail by dragging it over.
Can I see how the code changes when you drag stuff around like this or resize?
Sure. It just, probably what you want to see is the code in preview mode rather than the code in edit mode, yeah? So the code of what the final site would look like.
Or do you want to see the JSON file?
Oh, all this data right now that you're changing is in the JSON file.
It's all in the JSON file, yeah. So if you look at the JSON file for this now, I think it's called homepage. So these are the items that are in this container. There's 2 of them. Each one has a UUID. That's used to namespace to scope the data that are in that item. So I'll show you that in a second. And then this is determining its width. The only data that it owns is the width. Because it's basically, that's all you can modify.
Anyway.
And the order, right? The order of the items and also the type, right? So this is actually the name of the component that renders that particular kind of tout. And the way you put the component, so this container, which we currently call a Flexbox, but are planning to rename something flow container or something like that. I can't remember what we're calling it.
Yes.
This container is configurable by a site builder to determine what can go into it. So if you go, this is a little more complex, but I'll try and show you. This one. So this is the raw component, this Flexbox grid that we're importing from Bodiless layouts. And then these HOCs that we're adding to it are automatically generating variations on the tout using using a set of supplied tokens. So whether or not it has a title is a token, whether or not it's horizontal or vertical is a token, whether or not in an actual world where you had different colors, what colors it has is a token. Each of these things, we've built an automatic generator that says, here's my set of tokens. matrix all these together and give me all the variations that are possible. And then we're saying use those variations as possible options in the Flexbox. And one of the things that we add is metadata. So whatever the metadata that go into this component selector are, all these facets, those are added by the site builder to say, this version has a with title and body facet for its structure. And this one has a no title facet for its structure, which involves applying this HOC. So we create all of these different facets or options, tokens that could be applied to the tout. And then this vary design function takes them and says, give me a list of all the possibilities. And that's what goes into the container. And that's what's available to the content editor to place. So in this case, we're placing a lot of them, but say you had a product page where all you wanted them to be able to place was product touts. You could simplify this for that page enormously and just say the only component you can add is a product tout. And that would let you build up your related products, for example. If that makes sense.
Yep, thank you.
Other questions or other things that people are interested in pursuing? I'll go through without actually going through them, but I'll just go through the other things that are in here. So in addition to layouts, there is a rich text editor. That was going to be the next thing. Our rich text component is really just a wrapper around the Slate.js rich text editor. So we just provide a way for you to create to really make any component editable using a Slate editor. One thing to point out and one of the reasons we chose Slate for this is because it allows you to configure what component will be used to render what mark or node in the editor. I don't know how many people are familiar with Slate, but essentially it stores, I can actually show you what its data format looks like. So it stores a document that looks like this. And for every node in that document, it has a type. And Slate lets you specify what component should be used to render a node of that type. And that's very useful for us because we anticipate that a site builder, as part of the design system, is going to have particular formatting that they want to apply to each node in their editor, each type. So for example, bold for them might be extra bold or might be semi-bold. And so we want, instead of using CSS, traditional CSS to do that styling, we basically want to say every bit of styling that you could apply is an HOC. And this Slate lets you say, apply these HOCs to the component that is used to render the bold or the strong mark. And that can be customized, readily customized on any site in a very precise surgical way where you're customizing just the thing that you want to customize. You don't have to worry about CSS bloat and all of the issues with CSS bleed and enforcing a BEM paradigm. It's much more, the API for styling something becomes much more clear and well-defined.
Hey, Chris, this is so awesome. Maybe just to wrap up, you can tell people, what because Bodiless is open source and maybe what you want to achieve with that.
Sure.
Do you see it as, your thing or do you want to get more people involved and what?
So I'll speak to that from my perspective, and then I'll also let Eric speak to that since he may have, as working for an agency, may have a slightly different feeling about it. So from our perspective, first and foremost, our thing, developed to meet use cases that we see, but whether or not it is actually chosen to be our thing is still very much in the air. Obviously, it's what we are recommending, but there's a lot of alignment that has to happen at J&J. Let's put it that way, in order for things to happen. So the open source working group at J&J, like I said at the beginning, is a new initiative in technology services, which is the part of J&J that I work for, to make what we do more available to the community, participate more actively in the open source community. So releasing this is partly an initiative that's aligned with those goals. I would say also, personally, I would love to see people pick this up. I definitely think, obviously, that it hits a sweet spot for certain use cases, specifically those in which your content and your presentation may be more closely tied, those in which you may want to be able to customize to optimize both reuse and customization, or where workflow is important. I think that it is not, as I said, it's not alone in the JAMstack space these days. There are other people barking up the same tree, which also leads me to believe that it may be valuable to people in the community. Eric, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I guess there's two things that I wanted to add. So one is, well, I don't disagree with you, Chris, that like J&J is doing this for J&J. And one of the big pushes for doing this is because if you're using a community-based thing, it's good for J&J.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're selling yourself a little bit short there, because, I mean, for example, all of the work that the team does right now is done in GitHub and not in Jira, right? We do all the tickets in GitHub, trying very hard to give the community exposure to what we're working on, where we're going, and what's happening in it. So I do think that you are making more of a commitment to the community than,
yes,
I would say we just open source this and it's out there, right?
Yes, that's definitely true. And part of the J&J open source working group thing is we sign a commitment to excellence, which basically says, we are there to support this now. J&J stands behind this. It's not just pushed out there and let to dry.
Right.
So yeah, that's true.
But also, I do work for an agency that does this work in lots of other places as well. And I'm hopeful that this is something that our agency will be able to use in other places as well. And I think that, I don't know how true that is for EPAM, but I imagine that's also a possibility for them as well. I can almost speak to that. But it does feel like a tool that hits a lot of use cases for building the web part of a much bigger ecosystem. Where in the past we would try to use Drupal for everything. This is for building the web, and then these other tools are for doing the other parts of the system. So I'm hopeful. I'm lobbying internally at my company to try to make this something that we also use. And we tend to try to use a lot of open source materials, and so we're trying to add this to our arsenal as well.
That's awesome. This is great. It was so interesting, and I really like to hear how people, what problems people are solving. I think it's a very interesting perspective to JAMstack that we don't hear a lot about. So this is fantastic.
Cool.
Does anybody else have any questions before we close up shop here?
Thank you so much. That was great. I do have one quick question. I know what you said earlier, but how much work do you think it would take to repurpose this for Next.js?
Interesting question. So when I haven't tried with Next when I was first of all, let me say, when we started this, we were building it using Vue and Next. And then we made this conscious decision to switch to React and Gatsby about 6 months in, mostly because of the size of the React community was so much larger at that point. We did an extensive evaluation. But when I was doing the initial port over to React, I looked at React Static as an alternative to Gatsby and was able to do a lot of things with React Static. Unfortunately, I was trying to do two things at the same time, and I rejected both from the combination, whereas I probably should have looked at them more individually. I'm not that familiar with Next, but I would think, so we've built it in a way that you can build your own backend, and you can build your own, essentially the controller that brings the data in and makes it available to the components. So you would just have to, we have a store that holds the data for the components, and that store is responsible for serializing it back to the backend. So you would just have to modify that store, which now takes the Gatsby data prop, so that it took whatever Next provides in terms of data to your components, and it should work. Not something I've tried, but something that was the idea that you might want to use a different generator is definitely informed the architecture.
Cool, thank you.
Well, I just want to thank you, especially Chris, for you know, pressing on when we had to move everything to online and that sort of thing, and being a guinea pig for our first online meetup.
My pleasure.
You know, so yeah, thank you very much. This is really fascinating, like I said.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for having us. I really appreciate this. We're hoping to do some talks. We've been accepted for Decouple Days in New York in July. So we're hoping to do that one, if hopefully that will happen. We don't know. We also are on in the queue waiting to see if the JAMstack Conf wants us to speak. I guess they're doing the London one virtually now.
Yeah, we are.
So we'll see. We'll see what happens with all of those. But appreciate the opportunity to cut our teeth on presenting and talking about this.
Thank you. No, we really appreciate it. This is fascinating, and this is also very different, as Bud said, from what we've seen. Did you said that you put in a CFP for London or San Francisco for JAMstack?
I put it in for London, okay. But if they do decide to go virtual, I do want to do an in-person one, so I might tell them I'll just wait.
Yeah, London is definitely virtual.
Right, but sorry, I shouldn't say if they do decide to go virtual. I should say I might just tell them, since they've decided to go virtual, that I'd rather wait for, if they accept me, I'd rather wait for San Francisco. Hopefully by October, either we'll all be dead or this will have passed. Sorry, too soon, I know.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks, Bud.